I would like to build on what Dr. Ferguson talked about. I guess this would be like chapter 2, if you will. I work with, as was mentioned in my introduction, I work with the Cook County Mental Health Court, which is a project that started actually 7 years ago and is kind of an offshoot of the drug courts. It's basically, just to give a little background, kind of a change in the approach of the justice system, which typically is adversarial in nature, where you have two different parties arguing to arrive at the truth and the sentence and guilt or not guilty, etc. Therapeutic courts, as they're called, or specialty courts is another way of approaching them, is a different approach in that it's non-adversarial. The object is to take people who have become involved in the criminal justice system, and instead of punishing them, we are trying to find new and innovative ways of helping them in this time, if they qualify by virtue of their charges, etc., and backgrounds. So basically, probably the first specialty court was mentioned a few minutes ago, namely the juvenile courts that started back. I think Jane Addams was somewhat involved in the beginning of that, way back. Fast forwarding ahead in time, we come to about 1989, and a woman whose name you might recognize, Janet Reno, when she was the district attorney of Dade County in Florida, came up with the idea of creating basically what turned out to be a specialty court, a drug court, and using the criminal justice system to get people who qualify into treatment and recovery rather than throwing them into jail and prison. And the drug courts grew throughout the country, and I'm of course glossing and bouncing ahead here in global ways, but the drug courts became successful and grew throughout the country. And about 10 years ago, they took that same concept and applied it to the problem of mental illness and the criminalization of the mentally ill. And Cook County actually was one of the very first mental health courts that was developed to deal specifically and only with people with felony convictions. We developed in 2004, April of 2004 is when we began operation, after about 2 years of developmental planning meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And so the object of the mental health court is to take that same concept of non-adversarial approach and work with people who meet the criteria by state law. And that criteria basically is that you have a serious mental illness, an Axis I diagnosis, so for instance schizophrenias or major depressions, bipolar, et cetera, and people who have non-violent backgrounds and current non-violent charges and non-sexual charges. So that's some of the criteria. And take those folks and voluntarily offer them the possibility, if they meet the criteria, to be a part of the mental health court. And there they would have to plead guilty to their charge, and they're placed on 2 years of probation. And through those 2 years, adhering to treatment and mental health services becomes actually the terms of their probation. So medication compliance, seeing a psychiatrist, going into psychosocial services if needed, getting their economic funding flowing again, getting them into job training or school if they qualify, or getting them into stable housing. Those are all things that we work on as case managers in the mental health court at Cook County to get those folks back into the road of recovery. And the object of it is to break that cycle of recidivism. Building on what was said a few minutes ago by Dr. Ferguson, these folks started out, and that's where I want to kind of focus a little bit. There's so much I could say, but I'm really constricted with time, and I'm jumping all over, but I'm trying to give you a little bit of a background. The people that I work with are primarily adults. We're not talking about children as such. But we have had young people, because obviously people in Cook County Jail who are are charged with felonies and so on are mostly 18 and over. Okay. So we have had some very young people. But what I want to say is that in the 7 years that we have been in operation, I've had the opportunity as a supervisor to really look closely at almost every one of their histories, if you will, after their assessments and all the intake activity that goes on to be admitted into the court. And I can say that almost without fault, every one of them started out in their early childhood. Okay, that's where the seeds were planted for their later ills and problems. So a lot of these folks, men and women both, started out coming from, unfortunately, very dysfunctional and broken homes, and probably were not able to have the kind of upbringing and things that many of us take for granted. So not having parents that were emotionally or physically available to them, or families and support systems, people who grew up in households where there was also mental illness existing that was being untreated, or people who grew up in households where there was a lot of drug and alcohol activity. So, and in poverty, lack of education, all of those factors were there in their childhood. And the other thing I think that's really significant in knowing this client population is the fact that many of them were subjected to a lot of trauma and abuse as children and young people. So both physically and sexually and emotionally. And if you talk to these folks that are clients in the mental health court and you get to know them and work with them in treatment, you find that almost all of them have been subjected to that in one form or another. If not directly, they've witnessed it. And so it's had a traumatic effect on the development in their life. So going through their history again, as you see, as small children, they're subjected to this, and then almost without fault, as you look at their development and listen to their histories, they usually start out in early adolescence or early in their teenage years, starting with alcohol or marijuana and using those types of drugs and experimenting. And then, of course, that follows the normal progression that one would expect if it goes untreated, and leads to very serious drug and addiction problems by the time they're in their 20s and 30s with heroin and crack cocaine. Usually in their late adolescence, early adult years, you start to see in their histories cropping up the first evidence of mental illnesses that are being diagnosed. So by that time, many of them have broken away from their homes. They're living in various places. They're out on the streets. They're being picked up by the police, and oftentimes they're taken to emergency rooms, and that's where you start to see the diagnosis of various types of mental illness cropping up. Usually the clients that we work with on a regular basis in the mental health court are usually, I would say, the average age is mid-30s to mid-40s. That would be the average. But that also takes into account that we've had much younger ones and we've had much older ones. But the majority of them are in that middle age period. And I think what that reflects is the fact that by that time in their life, when this opportunity is offered to them, they're ready to accept that kind of help, because plainly and simply they're tired, I think, of the lifestyle they've been living. Okay? Being out in the streets for 20 or more years, serious addiction problems, and mental illnesses that are basically not being treated or controlled in any way. And so when they're admitted into our court, as I said earlier, the case management and the court team, the judge, the state's attorney, public defender, probation, and our task case managers work intensively with them through those 2 years to get them into recovery for their substance addictions and to get them on their medications and stabilized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to get them into a recovery kind of state of mind and focus. And we work with